Oh boy, oh boy. This is our final worldview that we're going to be dealing with during this series. There are a few more we could deal with, but they're not really as impactful and probably important for the modern world stage. Today is going to be a little bit complex, but if you understand it, you will understand everything that's going on right now in our culture, because this is where our culture is right now. Tonight we're going to be dealing with postmodernism. Everyone say postmodernism. There we go. Okay, postmodernism as defined as coming after modernism. Well, what is modernism? You may know what modernism is.
It's everything you were not taught.
Okay.
After,
Modernism was kind of the scientific age. It was sort of the emergence of the sciences. And they had this view that was called scientific positivism, which is where they said, you know what, once we learn enough, we're going to know everything that we need to know. We're going to know, like, science will teach us ethics. It's going to teach us everything once we understand science well enough. And so the modern age was all very optimistic, but then things started happening, like World War I and then World War II. And then the rise of communism, and then this massive sweeping like genocides that are taking place all over the world. And all of this fervor that we had and all this upbeat feeling about how science and technology and reason were going to save us kind of went in the toilet. So that was modernism. Postmodernism is the view that we've now kind of taken on after modernism. It's really the culmination of most of the views we've been through so far. So I'll explain to you how as we get rolling here. But before we do, let's pray, shall we? Let's talk to the Lord. Oh, Lord our God, we praise you. What a beautiful day. What an amazing life that you've given us. And another day to engage our minds, to engage our hearts, and to look forward not just to what you have for us in this life, be it difficult or something that benefits you or something wonderful, but also what comes after this life. Father, we praise you for that, and that we can keep our eyes on that prize and remember what it is you've called us to do here and now. Father, as we engage with this topic, again, we want to ask wisdom beyond our natural needs. Holy Spirit, teach us and direct us and help us to understand in a way that benefits you and your kingdom. We love you, Lord Jesus. It's in your name we pray. Amen. All righty. Postmodernism. Well, quick recap. Worldviews are a set of presuppositions which may be true, or entirely false, partially false. But they're presuppositions. They're ideas that we have that are kind of unquestioned, that undergird everything we believe. That being said, we went through a whole series of these so far. Monotheism was belief in one God, okay? A lot of religions encompass that. Deism, okay? So one God, yeah, creates the world and then leaves it alone, steps back, lets everything just kind of run. Naturalism or materialism. Yep, matter, energy, time, space, those things are real. Things that are physical, things that are made of physical stuff are real. No such thing as a God, no such thing as a spirit, no such thing as categories of things, even like love. Those are just descriptive terms, but if it doesn't have physical reality, it's not really real. Okay, nihilism. Yes, it doesn't matter. I always had students when I was teaching high school on this, and every time we got to nihilism, somebody would go, it doesn't matter. All right, existentialism. Oh, that one's hard. There we go. Create your own meaning. Okay, so existentialism recognizes naturalism. It recognizes the truth of nihilism, that there is no objective meaning. And so an existentialist says, well, then we're going to make it up. And so we make up our own meaning and value and purpose. Eastern, pantheistic, monism. Eastern?
many gods.
Okay, so they do have many gods. All right, so there are many deities in that paradigm. All is God, so they have kind of one God in a sense, but not like the monotheist God. There's no fruit on the tree. We don't understand what we're talking about. No fruit on the tree. This is God lowercase g. All things taken together as a whole. Pantheism, all things are God, all things are one. So there any difference or distinction you try to create with your mind, it's not real. Monism is one, all is one. So pantheos, pan means all, and theos, God. So all is God, all is one.
So why do they break separate gods?
They have separate deities that they treat almost as kind of a subcategory. They're think of them as like more like devotions to a particular deity. But a good pantheist knows that all gods are ultimately the same God, and I am that God, and you are that God, and whatever you scrape off the bottom of your shoe is also that God. Right? So it's all God. Everything is God. Okay, New Age. Dipped into this last week. What can you tell me about the New Age worldview? Yeah, burning man. So we talked about the neo-pagan ideas that, you know, there's these elaborate kind of pagan rituals that are taking place in deserts. Spirit animals, spirit guides. So you oftentimes they'll use this altered state of mind. And how do we get an altered state of mind? Okay, drugs is one of the methods that has been traditionally used. Meditation, transcendental meditation. The idea is we leave self, we open ourselves up to this spirit realm. There's a real spirit realm. And then, you know, sometimes we'll have something like the spirit coyote that shows up and takes us on a spirit journey, right? And so that's the idea behind it. Yeah, Josh?
So I have a buddy who's pretty heavily involved in this.
Yeah.
Especially the drug part. And my question to him generally is, how do you know that you're not just hallucinating?
Yeah.
And for him,
yeah.
his response is usually, well, how is what you believe any more real than mine?
Yeah.
And
right. I have had an experience, therefore my experience is valid. And again, if you're a new ager, it is about the experience. So your experience becomes the most real and most important thing. Again, that's part of why I said toward the end of the session last week, I don't know if you remember this or not, but like one of the best things we can do for people who are very into new age ideologies is ask that God will reveal the dark aspect of what they're engaged in and what is happening with them.
So it's distinctly possible that what they are dealing with is real.
An actual demon, yeah. Or many demons. You know, the whole purpose of demons, and you know, demonology is a discussion for another time, but the whole purpose and function of demons is to disrupt the mission of God in this world. And they don't do that by straightforward methods. It's not generally like they go, we want you to worship Satan. That doesn't help a demon at all. That doesn't help Satan at all. The idea is how much distraction, how much chaos can I sow into the world? How much can I disrupt the mission of God? And so something like a delusion that somebody opens himself up to and willingly seeks out, I mean, a demon's going to jump on that, right? It's an opportunity to just say, let me completely mess with your mindset, and everybody you come in contact with, I can help you to promote that deceit out beyond yourself. So yeah, demonology, put that on a list of to-dos. All right, so that was New Age religions. Today we're going to be dealing with postmodernism. Postmodernism. I think some of you guys have heard me tell the story before. I was in a philosophy classroom at Miami University, and it was an introduction to philosophy class. It was one of the early classes. I think we were doing like philosophy, ancient to medieval or something like that. But in the midst of it, my professor kept saying over and over again the term postmodern. And he kept saying postmodern and postmodern. And this is very postmodern and postmodern, postmodern. And as this was going on, I had studied enough that I knew what postmodernism was already. I had a decent handle on it. But based on what he was saying and how the other students in the classroom were using the term, I was pretty sure they did not know what it meant. And so I asked the professor, I just raised my hand and I said, you've said postmodern a lot in class so far this year. Can you please explain to me what postmodern means? And he just kind of stopped and went, well, you know, I think if you can define postmodernism, then you probably don't understand it.
Oh.
Yeah. And so my immediate response was, you know, I just raised my hand immediately. He's like, yeah, man. So if you can't define postmodernism, you do understand it? And he's like, yeah, it is kind of a tricky thing, isn't it? Yeah, it kind of is. Postmodernism. Yeah, I tried. Well, I talked to him after class to explain. I didn't want to make it into a whole embarrassment. anytime you try to embarrass a professor in front of a classroom, you're going to get in trouble. Now, you can do it with questions. It's very easy to do it with questions in a genial fashion. But if you press and go, well, let me explain to you, you're on the naughty list. Okay. In order to understand postmodernism, a couple terms you're going to need to know in order to just know the verbiage so we understand what I'm speaking about. Number one, narrative. A narrative is a story. Okay, so postmodernists will say narrative. And what they're talking about is a way people explain life. How do we know what's true in this world? Well, you might say, well, the scientific method helps us. Like, yeah, but that's a narrative. That's a story that people tell, right? Scientific method is just one story. There are other ways of knowing things. There are many ways of knowing or understanding. Your friend who is engaged in these drug use, that is a different way of knowing things, and that's his story. Everybody has a narrative, all right? So narrative, meta-narrative. Everyone say meta-narrative. This is the most important term for understanding postmodernism. A meta-narrative, meta means like the larger or the bigger. A meta-narrative is a narrative, a story that tries to explain everything or thinks that it can explain all things. Can you think of a meta-narrative? Okay, Big Bang cosmology might be part of it. They would probably say like more like science or physics maybe, they might say. Physics would be a meta-narrative that tries to explain a lot of things. Christianity would be a meta-narrative, right? And so any of the major religions are what they would call meta-narrative. You would have other meta-narratives, like capitalism would be a meta-narrative, right? Or communism. It's trying to tell a story about how the world works and ought to work, and it's trying to explain everything through that lens. It's a meta-narrative. It's bigger than simply a story. It's a story that shapes all the stories. Does that make sense? Okay. Lastly, relativism. Relativism. What is relativism? Kind of defined it for you there. Somebody want to read that for me?
The doctrine that no ideas or beliefs are universal true, but they're all true. But that all are. Instead, relative, that is, their validity depends on the circumstances in which they are applied. Okay. So any belief, any given belief is as valid as any other belief. Any way you describe a reality is as valid as every other reality. Everybody's opinion is equally valid. Okay, relativism. All right, narrative is what? A story, meta-narrative. Yeah, story of stories. It's a big story that tries to explain everything. Relativism. It's true to you.
Yeah, what's true for you is true for you. What's true for me is true for me. Everybody gets to have their own truth. And as Oprah would say, live your own truth.
Is this the same thing as subjectivism?
Yeah, relativism and subjectivism could be used fairly interchangeably. The idea of relativism, though, is not just that I have my opinion, you have your opinion. It's that our opinions are equally valid in whatever sphere of influence we have them. So the sub-Saharan tribe that practices female circumcision and cruelly engages in those things, they've got their own truth and their own reality, and you are not in a condition as a Westerner to explain to them that what they're doing is wrong. Okay? That is relativism. Okay, definitions and attributes. We're going to try to just kind of ease our way into postmodernism here. Where have you ever heard the term postmodernism before? Okay, architecture. It's one of the first things that people typically think about when they think postmodernism. In fact, when most people hear the term postmodernism, they think, oh, that's a type of architecture. That's a way you build interesting buildings. The other way that you're typically going to hear that is in a description of art or architecture. Bill, do you know what makes architecture postmodern? I'm not meaning to put you on the spot. Anybody else can jump in here too.
It is architecture that probably is produced like after the Industrial Revolution.
Okay.
Starting early in the 19th
Right. Yeah, and particularly when you're looking for postmodern architecture, you're looking at architecture that does not have structural function necessarily. Okay, so like you see this building here in the lower right, that is a postmodern building. All right, now looking at that, would you say that most of that is put together in such a way as to help really hold up the structure? Is that the best way you could build a building?
It's a big waste of space.
Okay. Right, now what they're trying to accomplish here, and there's a famous postmodern piece of architecture up in Columbus where they've got stairways that lead nowhere. They've got balconies that have no access to the balcony. And they've got like, it's a ridiculous piece of architecture. But the idea is architecture should not be just functional. We should make something that is weird, that is strange. All right, something that is interesting to the eye. Now, I look at that in the lower right, and I think that's pretty interesting. Yeah. Yep. Correct. Yeah. And there are artistic buildings throughout history, but some of these buildings, the way they're being put together is, again, like stairways to nowhere. What statement is being made there exactly? Yeah. Let them just climb up and topple down and they're not going to leave. All right. This other artwork here on the lower left, I don't know if you can see what that is. Can anybody describe what you're seeing there? It is disturbing, isn't it? All right.
Man with or person kind of like one of these big ear things on it so you can run around and bang his head.
Yeah. It looks like a filter unit jammed into a face, and the face appears to be on giant babies that are crawling around in a park. This is, and here's what you would see is people would say, well, that's very postmodern. What do they mean by that? All right. Useless. It doesn't accomplish anything. All right. So postmodernism. Does anybody want to try to define it before I start dipping into how we actually define the whole thing? If you don't, that's okay. Okay. I'm kind of afraid of where that's going to be going. Architecture and art are typically where we're going to see these terms applied most often in popular usage. When you get into the universities, you're going to hear people banding this term about all over the place to describe anything and everything. These ideas are not well known as postmodernism, but what you're going to see is these ideas are pervasive throughout our culture right now. Everything that postmodernism is, does, says, thinks is prevalent right now in this culture. It's what's directing the course of the United States of America right now. All right, that being said, postmodernism is not just fuzzy at the edges. It's not just that it's kind of hard to define on the outside. It's very much hard to define on the inside. I remember the first time I had to study postmodernism, I was at Cincinnati Christian University, and they put it into a philosophy course. And I remember being angry after having studied it, because I was like, why did we have to waste our time with this? There is no center to this. There's no meaning to this. There's no purpose. They can't even define it themselves. Why should we have to be able to defend against it? But they were right in having us learn, because, again, an idea does not have to make sense in order for the populace to embrace it. You notice that? All right. So how would we define postmodernism? Let me go to some of the founders of postmodernism and let's see what they say. This is Ihab Hassan. He's the first guy to coin the term postmodernism. Here's what he says, and says would be in early 2000s. I know less about it now than I did 30 years ago, 1971, when I first started writing about it. Still today, no consensus has been reached as to what the word means. He created the word, he created the term, and he says, it's less clear to me what it means now than it was initially. Now, at one stage of the game, a lot of postmodernist thinkers, writers got together to actually come up with a strict definition and some paradigms for postmodernism. And they met for like 6 hours and they left not being able to, completely disagreeing on how postmodernism should be defined. But somebody says, if you paid attention, you probably saw some blood spilling out from beneath the sill. In other words, they didn't just disagree, they aggressively disagreed on what postmodernism is. Okay, so we've heard from the founder. So Ihab Hassan tries to describe postmodernism and what it means when he says this. Here we go. Here's his definition. Fragments, hybridity, relativism, play, parody, an ironic anti-intellectual stance. They're anti-ideological, thank you. Yes, they are anti-intellectual as well in some regards. I'll show you that in a little bit. All right, so fragments, little pieces of things. Hybridity, do you know what hybridity means? Yeah, it's when you mesh things together, you mash them together. Relativism, everybody gets to be right. We already talked about that. Play, to some degree, it's just entertainment. Parody, it's mocking, it makes fun of things. And an ironic anti-ideological stance. They disdain ideas. It's an idea set that hates ideas and goes after every other idea. It kind of does. A lot of this is going to sound like a Monty Python production before all said and done. Now, I'm intentionally, by the way, if you're like, this is not helping yet, Ben, I know. I'm intentionally trotting out how confusing this is at the outset. I'm going to help narrow this down and focus it in a moment here. Mark Lillo, one of the famous writers regarding postmodernism, describes it this way: a loosely structured constellation of ephemeral disciplines like cultural studies, gay and lesbian studies, science studies, and post-colonial theory. It borrows freely from a host of works. Given the impossibility of imposing logical order on ideas as dissimilar as these, postmodernism is long on attitude and short on argument. It's an attitude. It's a pervasive attitude. All right, let's talk narrative and meta-narrative and see how postmodernism figures into this idea. All right, here's what postmodernism says. First-hand knowing is impossible. How did you come to know about Christianity? Your parents. And how did they put Christianity into you? They talked about it using what? Words. They used words. They used life. Are words objective reality? Okay. Would you say that maybe learning English at this time period in America makes you think differently than if you had learned, say, Swahili? Or maybe first century Greek? Do words have power? Have you ever seen something lost in translation? Okay. Now, the postmodernists, I think, have something here. Again, we want to be able to find things that have some merit. But here's what they say. As soon as you begin hearing using words, there's no longer objectivity. You're now receiving a narrative, because even the language is a narrative. The way you phrase things, the way you think about things. Let me just use this term, phobic. Is that a good term or a bad term? Phobic. Now we would say relative, right? How does the culture feel about it?
You can't be word phobic.
Yeah, word phobic. If I tag phobic in at the end of most anything, it's generally considered to be a negative. How did we get that way? Was it that way 40 years ago?
Some more kind of slowly indoctrinated the way that they wanted you to think.
Yes.
And or be
intentionally or unintentionally?
Intentionally.
Intentionally. It began to be tagged into words so that they could control the way people were thinking. And now, does anybody think twice about it now?
Now it's a very evil word.
Right.
They depend on.
Okay. And
to be you're afraid of spiders or heights.
Yep.
But now you should die because you're phobic about,
anything.
or ideas or.
Okay. Now this is interesting because some of you were alive for a long time before that word and that term was applied to things and used that way, right? And so when you hear it, you still probably go, realize that anybody who is maybe less than 20 years old right now thinks that that is a permanent part of the language structure. That's always been here. That's always been a negative thing. And their mindset is shaped by that term and the way that term's used and how it's used.
If they live long enough, they will see something else change, and then they will be the ones saying,
Sure.
whoa, wait a minute.
Sure. Now, the postmodernist is basically saying this. As soon as we have used language as a medium, you've already bought into at least one story. It's one story that you've been told, and just the way you're hearing it, you're believing it, you're accepting it. And you, without question, you can't even think outside of the English language unless you have a second or third language that you're prolific with, right? Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. So this is, the postmodernist wants to stay at the outset. First-hand knowing is impossible. You cannot know anything. So you say, I'm a Christian, I know God. And they'll say, how? Well,
Make it intrinsic.
yeah, you would, I mean, if I were going to say it, I would say I studied the Bible, maybe something like that. But the intrinsic, they would go, okay. So you believe that you have this intrinsic knowledge of God. Well, where did that come from? And they're going to trip you up. By the way, they trip people up who are Christians all the time with this stuff, because they're going to keep running you back to over and over again going, well, I depend on my knowledge set from this. You know, it was given to me by my parents. It was given to me by my church. Well, your church is a whole narrative. Christianity is a whole narrative. And so you just believe that narrative. The most difficult debate I ever had in college was before I really knew how to debate with a postmodernist. And it was a guy who just continually ran me back to the idea that, well, that's just one narrative that you've been told, and you just believe that story. But there are other stories.
But they believe science.
Yeah, and they would say science is useful. It's the airflow. I'm like, who's humming? Yeah, so they would say science is pragmatic and it's useful. It's a story that is functional, but it's just a story. And, you know, we might have arrived at some of the same conclusions through mythologies. We could have arrived at the same conclusions through other means, but science is one narrative, they would say. This gets them in trouble, by the way. But
How do they explain when archaeologists go back and find all of these items that support Christianity?
Yeah, and they would say, well, that's a narrative again, and we're depending on that structure and construction. And sure, you might say that this is part of history, but who knows how history came to us? And they'll cite like a game of telephone, right? You know, where you've got information that's corrupted as it passes along, and they try to use that as an illustration. We really can't trust anything. And even if you did get the story, you've gotten it through words, and you've gotten it through ideas from people who believed those ideas, which means you didn't just get the words, but you were accepted their value of the words. So when I say righteousness, you guys probably think positively, right? But what about anybody who's not a Christian? When they hear righteousness, what do they think? They're generally looking at it as a negative. Okay, so you didn't just take in this idea through words, you've taken in like a whole story with it, whether you wanted to or not. Okay.
So a narrative is a story.
Yep.
And if someone tells a story to a child that don't put your hand on the stove because it's hot.
Right.
He does that.
Yep.
So he's now defining hot stove. If he would have said, don't put your hand on the stove because it's cold, he would define that sensation as cold.
Right. If you continually conveyed that idea to him, you could choose to trick and confuse your children all you wanted to, I suppose. But I mean, and you would redefine reality for them. Their whole reality would frame up differently than the rest of the realities around them. And I guess we see this kind of thing through trauma all the time. I mean, kids who are abused and taught that abuse is normalized and real and an ordinary part of life sometimes function that way. It's so distracting.
Hot is a word.
Yeah.
Cold is a word. And they chose to define hot as an elevated temperature.
Right.
And cold as a very decreased temperature.
Yeah.
But if you just flip the words, it doesn't make a difference.
Right.
Everybody agrees on the flip.
Yeah. So what you're saying, Bill, is there's a reality behind the words.
Right.
Yes, and I would agree.
I wouldn't say there's a reality, but how you choose to define that reality is through your words. And what we think was hot was defined as cold, and vice versa. Today we'd be calling it stove cold.
Correct.
Ice hot.
Yeah. And they like that kind of a discussion where you just say, you know, we've randomly like shaped out these words and these concepts, but what you're getting out is really important here. There is a reality behind the words. So whether I call hot hot or cold cold, or call it you know, pepperoni or whatever, there's a reality that my words are trying to get at or describe, right? They're usually content to just let people be uncomfortable with the idea that words even conveying it makes us uncertain of everything. Right? Notice the postmodernist is going to start driving us toward uncertainty in everything.
How can they be certain if their words are?
Great question.
It's their word.
Great question.
Their questioning of everything being a narrative to
Yep.
us. Could that have been a narrative we, you know, passed down to them, that they're questioning us because somebody else put it down with words in their mind? So,
Right.
did they may require anything like that back at?
Yes. And you're getting at some of the chinks in the armor, as it were. The armor's not so good on postmodernism.
It bothers me the way they change the language though.
Yep.
Because I get bored when I'm teaching and the kids are supposed to be doing something. I can watch them and do a word search from the computer.
Yeah.
And I found out that the word HOE does not exist.
Yeah.
Now I got blisters on my hand from moving one of them things for years.
Yeah.
But because of some rappers using it for or,
Yeah.
that word no longer exists.
Yeah.
And I have found about a dozen of those words. That, I mean, it
Mhm.
comes back to the computer and says, that's not a word.
Yeah. Yeah.
All I gotta do is for you.
Well, I saw that supposedly is now in the dictionary. Supposedly. Yeah. Not supposedly, supposedly is now in the dictionary, because they're doing the same thing. I mean, they're taking terms as people misuse them, and then they integrate them to language. But this is for the postmodernists, this is indicative of how they kind of take the evolutionary principle and then they apply it to knowledge in general. And they just say, we're all part of this greater evolution of ideas and thoughts. And we think that we're being reasonable or rational, but we're just operating according to the stories we've been handed. Now, just very quickly, if we were to administer a test in the United States right now, standardized test, one of the first things that is going to be said in criticism of that test is, this is white, male-centered knowledge. All right, now, why would that be? Where does that idea come from? Okay, and this is postmodernism. Postmodernism says you white people, particularly you white males, are controlling the story for the whole culture, and you have been for a while. And so you have a power hold right now on ideas, and you're making people who can't operate according to your rules play by your rules in this game. And so it's a postmodern idea. All right, so firsthand knowing is impossible. We think in narrative. Everything you think about is story oriented. You're structuring things. We are narrative ourselves. Your very life is a story. So do you think objectively? Do you think objectively or subjectively? Do you see reality as it is? What do you think? Okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. They would. And they would say that anybody who thinks they think objectively is mistaken. All right. We are all entirely subjective. You're not objective in any real sense. Yeah. Yeah. All right. No story is better than any other story. So if there is a story that's being put out there, every story must be considered equally valid, because we don't know which story is the most correct, do we? How would we? We are narrative. We think in narrative.
Would experience have anything to do
Yeah, and they would say experiences will usually confirm your reality because you have a confirmation bias. So,
What if it doesn't
Confirmation
confirm?
bias.
yeah, you're going to look around at the world and you're going to go, that makes sense according to my story. That makes sense according to my story. That makes sense because you're fitting everything into like your existing paradigm, right?
That's what they say.
That's what they say.
But if my experience proves that I was wrong about something,
Mhm.
I'm objectively looking at my experience and going, oh, I was raised to think this, but now something.
Yeah.
Not capable of doing it.
Yeah, and they would say that you're refining your story to make it fit better, to make it fit the reality you're living in. Right. All right. And yeah, that's Terry. That's one of the typical criticisms that's actually offered on this, because when they say your truth, my truth, every truth is completely valid, just saying, well, throw open that window, step outside, and tell me the same thing. Because if every truth is equally valid, then we're saying that, I could just decide gravity's not going to function for me, and I'll step out the window and that'll be fine.
Truth by its very nature, there's one truth on any subject, on any subject.
And they would say that's your story. And the only reason you think that is because you were raised with a Western ideology that was shaped out by the Greeks, the Greek philosophers, who believed in the law of non-contradiction. Something can't be both true and false at the same time. But that's a story you just accepted, and that is your presupposition now. It's your foundation. But it doesn't have to be that way. Not everybody else in the world sees it that way. See how this is kind of irritating to try to argue against? They would say, yeah, it does. It'll fall. I mean, we probably all agree that that's going to fall. You would say that's because of gravity, but people who don't understand anything about gravity experience the same thing, and they might experience it differently. Some people have never questioned why that drops to the ground, right? Nobody, and by the way, we still don't know how gravity works. You and I just talked about that not too long ago, didn't we?
Article in this morning's paper, cross-reference back on that. They still don't know, but they claim they're getting closer.
To understanding gravity?
No, they're trying to define, they started off doing something, they were trying to define dark matter.
Yeah.
And somehow they ended up bombarding something with, in that thing in France. And ended up with pieces missing.
Okay. Yeah. A lot of the physics that is being conducted at the smallest levels, we keep finding things that don't make sense and are really hard to describe or understand. Was the Heisenberg's uncertainty principle? Like you can know the position of an electron or the motion of the electron, but you can't know the same thing at the same time. You can't know both of those things. It's yeah.
You can tell where it went.
Yeah.
That one you usually do.
All right. Sources of postmodernity. Where did this ridiculous deconstruction of this world come from? Weird. Now, the idea is they don't address the what is true, but how something is true. Okay, so if there is a truth, it doesn't matter. You're not going to talk about what is objectively true. You're going to talk about how people arrived at their various beliefs. Now, do you know why Marxism would be very popular with postmodernists? If there is no objective truth, no ultimate reality, then we're all framing it up and making it up. Marxism describes a reality where two different groups are at odds. It's all balanced on dual scenarios where we've got this contention between groups. So you got the bourgeois and the proletariat, those who have and those who don't, and they're at war with one another. Critical theory, have you guys heard of critical theory? The critical theory is now emerged and is prevalent in our culture. It's basically everything against everything. Everything is pitted against everything. Do you want to know why we keep having to fight about racism? because they want us to keep fighting about racism. And it's this ideology, postmodernism, thrives on conflict, because my story, your story, their story, their story. That one's a bad story. That one's a good story. But it's all stories, and we can keep changing what we're holding to and believing so that we are perpetually fighting about everything. And do you see how the adversary might be involved in that? All right. Truth then is pragmatically defined. How does it work? So is communism true as a meta-narrative? Well, I mean, it functions somewhat. I mean, you might not say it helps humans to flourish or helps human life very much, but it was fairly effective. I mean, controlled a major portion of the world, and it kills off its detractors, things like that. So it is somewhat effective. Truth is pragmatic. Science, functional, it works. Engineering helps us build bridges, helps us build buildings. Those are true, those are functional, but it's still just a story. Foucault said all the stories are geared toward power. Every story that exists is all about power. So how would engineering be about power? Yeah. In a sense, it gives you control over, you've mastered a certain venue, and it gives you control over that. So long as you're describing things the way you want, you become an expert in that field, and now you have control over that field and the way it's conducted. And so it's a power structure, power relationship. Foucault Foucault had some really weird sexual proclivities, by the way. He agonized over whether or not rape should be illegal. Because he felt like the worst thing you can do to somebody is tell them their story is wrong. And truly, he was kind of a pervert, so there's that. All right, power struggles. It's all power struggles. You've heard the term white privilege. What is white privilege? Right, you have the power. Your narrative is the accepted one in this country.
Well, I think we're also saying that we can't understand anybody else's narrative.
Mm-hmm.
It's all about our narrative.
Yes, and so the focus, the education focus, needs to be turned to Black voices, is the way this will be described. And it's not just Black people, because then you have some Black people who have a white voice, they'll say, because they tend to agree with white people on things. So you're looking for somebody who has a very different perspective, a Black perspective. And so we're going to take the education field right now, and the education field needs to, I know we used to think that we were just teaching kids and that they were learning when we taught them histories, but now we got to do alternative histories, because we've got to get away from the popular story, the white story. Now that is, again, what's happening here. This is a postmodern idea. The idea is we've just got all these truths that are competing, and we need to let the other truths compete. The best way to do that is to shut down this whole sector of things that have been working well for a while. Let's go this way instead. All right. Here's where it emerged. Here's where postmodernism came from. English departments. It was the English and literature departments are the ones who generated postmodernity. Now, it used to be, if you went back about 100 years and you were studying English literature, what would you do in that department? If you were an English lit major, you'd study the classics. You'd read people like Shakespeare, right? You'd probably read Beowulf. You'd probably read major pieces of literature, and you would gain a mastery over a particular sector of things. It had been considered a fairly dry piece of academia for a while, but a number of students started stepping up, and they went, literature is more than this. Literature is about telling a story, and isn't everything just really a story? And then they began to force that idea out on everybody. And so you had these radicals where the English department was considered a fairly dry department because it was doing the same things for years. Now they became a radical department that was trying to change everything. And instead of focusing on here's what's great about Shakespeare, they started going, let's deconstruct Shakespeare and show what's wrong with this guy. Let's deconstruct any number of English works, and let's show what's wrong with these things. Now, deconstruct is the major word here. Yeah, this is how postmodernism functions. They destroy and they deconstruct. They criticize. It is a whole worldview framed up on criticism. If I were to offer you one word to describe what postmodernism is, it's criticism. It's universal criticism. Wonder why social media emerged when it did. All right. Dynamic literature, they began to put together, these pieces where they would basically criticize. And then it kind of spread from the English departments out into the history departments. And we began to deconstruct history. So known histories that have been existing for a long time, that have been unquestioned by and large, because they were well validated, people then began to deconstruct and say, that's probably not true, that's probably not true, that's probably not true. The reader and the listener is exalted in postmodernism. It's not about what's objectively true, it's about what you think about it. So we're in a culture right now where, I don't know if you've noticed this or not, if I say, that really offends me, have I lost power or gained power? I've gained power. Was it that way 30 years ago? If I said, that really offends me, people would be like, dude, soft. What's wrong with that guy? How did that flip? How did it become something where I can just say, I'm offended, or that really upsets me, or that triggers me, and suddenly I have the reins, I'm in power, and anybody who is challenging me is now the bad guy? Well, it's because my view has been exalted. My experience is exalted. And how dare you make me feel something bad? That's the result of postmodernism. All right. Postmodernism, the literature departments describe people they call the strong poets. The strong poets. Can't you just hear a literature professor saying something like this? It's like Dead Poet Society. Yeah. The strong poets were people whose narratives were so strong that they shaped all of culture. Sigmund Freud was a strong poet. Why? Because he was a psychologist, but he had everyone talking about the ego and the id and talking about the Oedipus complex. And how did he do that? He created a narrative. He created a story, and it dominated the universities for decades. Isn't that true?
Paid a lot for credit hours.
Yeah. and now that stuff is completely worthless and scoffed at in most every university setting. Yeah, Freudianism is on the outs. Yeah, by the time I was in college in the 90s, there was only one department that I was in that even talked about Freud anymore, and it was the classics department, because psychoanalysis has not been very effective in general. They actually do, like in just general practice, psychoanalysis, like if you left people unevaluated and untreated with psychoanalysis, and then you gave people psychoanalysis, the people who had psychoanalysis actually did worse than those who had nothing. So like in terms of practice, it began to diminish over time. But beyond that, Freud's ideas, people just, I think, started to recognize that Freud was kind of a pervert and a sicko. And all he did, I mean, think about what Freud did. All he did was he constructed a way to see everything in the world. And if you can create a good set of lenses and people start looking around, they're like, oh, it's true, sexuality's everywhere, sexuality's everywhere. Well, yeah, I mean, if that's what's on your lenses, you're going to see it everywhere. And that's what Freud did. But they'll say other people were strong poets, people like Moses. Right? Moses changed the way people thought. He brought monotheism into the world in a sense, or at least that's the way they view it. Jesus Christ, they would say, was a strong poet. He captured the imagination of so many people. Many people now think the way Jesus thought or function the way Jesus did, but just because he created a good narrative. That's what he did. Okay. Post-modernity in practice. How do you become a good practicing postmodernist? Here's how. What do you think? What do you do? You criticize. You criticize and criticize and criticize. You disparage most of academia. Right? So you look around at the university and you ridicule and you rip people apart. You especially go after philosophy departments. You know why?
because it's so subjective.
Yeah, well, philosophy
Don't buy it.
philosophy destroys postmodernism. When the two things meet in debate, philosophy tends to completely undermine, good philosophy tends to undermine postmodernism. Postmodernists hate philosophers because they're like, your rules of logic are a story. So yes, you can make me look stupid in a debate, but you're just using your own rules of logic, and I don't have to accept what you say, right? The sciences have typically had a lot of tension with postmodernists because, again, science is just a narrative. But every realm of academia, they're going to look at and typically go, that's a narrative, except for lesbian dance theory. And I mean, really, the stuff that is like the super liberal stuff, that's the kind of stuff they embrace because they say, oh, here is a different voice, right? All right. Disparage all social meta-narrative. Things like democracy. Democracy good? They would say, no, it's just a narrative. Things like justice. Your idea of justice is just forged by your culture. Or how about something like terrorism? The postmodernists were the ones telling us, you can't call people a terrorist. Those people are freedom fighters. You're just not seeing it from their perspective. Sure, they're killing children and stuff, but that's part of their culture. All right, law. Law is a meta-narrative. Reduce all truth claims to storytelling. This is how you're a good practicing postmodernist. Anytime somebody claims anything is true, you just let them know that that's a story that they've been told. You try to remind them that your story that you're telling has been forged in the crucible of your culture and in your little church and everything else you've done. All right, criticize, criticize, criticize. Oh no, post-modernity got into the church. Your church is in my post-modernity. Your post-modernity is in my church. All right, post-modernity and the church. This is a very unfortunate turn of events that has been disastrous for Christianity. The church that is postmodern is known typically as the emergent church. If you ever hear a church described as an emergent church, that's a church you don't want to go to. POMO is another way they'll describe it, a POMO church. All right, so what's POMO church like? Continual criticisms of the rest of what the church thinks and practices. Postmodern churches like to look around at every other version of Christianity, particularly congregations like ours. If you are conservative Christian, if you believe that the Bible is the absolute word of God and it reveals absolute truth, you have bought into meta-narrative. And there are members of the church who say, it's not like that. God's not telling that kind of story. Any Christian, they would say, who believes they can be certain about something is a dangerous Christian. All right? So do you believe that Jesus died for your sins and that you have the promise of eternity? Yes. Well, they would say, well, that makes you kind of a dangerous person. If you tell people that they can be certain about these kinds of things, you're not joining in God's story. Have you heard Christians talk about joining in God's story? And some of that language came through the postmodern and emergent churches. Right? They diminish language and doctrine, specifically doctrine that seems rigid. All right, so anytime we try to use language to describe certain things, they're going to be like, well, that's not exactly what righteousness means. And really, there are a lot of different ways to view it. The Jews have some different versions of viewing these things. And oftentimes they will side with people who are irreligious, non-religious, or like practicing Jews or Muslims if they can be seen as more inclusive, right? So I'm not going to accept the Christian version. We'll go other people's versions. If your doctrine is rigid, I can't affiliate myself with you. The gospel is redefined to describe social justice. God's story is all about human flourishing. Now, human flourishing is a good Christian idea. Humans doing well, all right? Flourishing, good idea. That terminology, though, has been handed to us through most of these postmodern churches, as it's typically used in a lot of churches right now. I'll even say it occasionally. So human flourishing is important. Inclusion is important. The depravity of humans and need for a savior are kind of set aside. Those are the wrong story. We don't want to talk about how human beings are bad, because you know what God thinks? Human beings are great. God thinks humans are the best. And so that's the way they're going to describe it. Human beings are really good. God is in favor of the whole human endeavor. God doesn't think that we're fallen, really. He just wants us to join his story. That sound a little problematic? I mean, have you read the Gospels at all? Do you know how, like the book of Isaiah, the latter part of the whole book of Isaiah, basically pours out the gospel message and conveys it. We're going to talk about that this Sunday. But in the context of that, when you get to the end of Isaiah, he says, you better follow this or else. Because we get to a salvation moment, the Messiah will come, he's going to restore all things, everything will be made right. That's the end. If you don't pay attention to this, you're in trouble. That would not fit with a postmodern church. Not the way they would want to describe it. Okay, other features of the postmodern church: a more relaxed attitude towards sin and doctrine in general. Here's what Rob Bell said. Rob Bell's a famous postmodernist. Okay, Rob Bell says, the Bible is kind of like a trampoline. You can take one spring off of the trampoline. You don't have to use everything that's there. You can take one spring off and kind of toss it away, and the trampoline still works. Right. But the thing about that, this is why it's a terrible example. I think it was an ill-advised example. If you've ever seen somebody jumping on a trampoline that's missing springs, you'll notice the springs next to it are having to stretch extra far. And then if you pop a few more off, what's going to happen is eventually you reach a point where your jump starts a chain reaction that goes, because they're like hooked all the way around. You just lose the whole trampoline in a moment, like you would lose the entire scripture once you just toss it all by the wayside. But that's Rob Bell's view, right? It's we don't have to believe everything that's in the scriptures. And so if you're familiar with Rob Bell's career, he was very popular back in the early 2000s. I was using his videos. A lot of people in the church were using his videos, reading his books. Then he was at his church. They had an art fair, we were doing this art thing, and somebody had a picture of Gandhi they made, and people were allowed to write comments underneath it. Somebody had written, "Reality check, Gandhi's in hell." And Rob Bell said, "I saw that and I thought, I just don't believe God would send Gandhi to hell." And so, do you know what Rob Bell decided? There is no hell. And so his perspective is there is no hell. Francis Chan wrote a book in response. His book, Love Wins, was basically saying that God will ultimately save everybody, whether they want to be saved or not. Francis Chan wrote a response to it called Erasing Hell, where he shut down Rob Bell in that book. All right. But that's the thing. If you are a postmodernist, it's a story, and God's letting you join the story. You get to kind of inform how God's story is even told.
Joel Osteen.
Yeah.
Only the positives.
Yeah.
Eliminates anything about a negative or hell or.
Yeah. You
go to heaven through Christ. Well, they asked him, does that mean a Muslim doesn't go to heaven? No, I'm not saying that.
Right.
I'm saying you go to heaven through Jesus.
Right.
Oh, okay. So if he doesn't believe it, then he's going to hell.
Right.
No, I'm not saying that.
I wouldn't say that. I'm never going to say that about anybody or anything. Yeah, Joel Osteen tells one little smidgen of the story and leaves a huge breadth of Christianity so far aside that you could hardly call what he's preaching the gospel. There's a lot of prosperity gospel with that guy too. It fit pretty neatly with a postmodernist, though. I mean, again, for a person who really just looks at this life and says we're all storytelling, I mean, how could God be upset at me if I'm just doing the thing that he created me to do? Just telling stories. Sorry, Lord. All right. Emergent churches have a tendency toward relativism. In other words, your view and everybody else's views need to be taken into consideration, and we want to just value people's stories as they see them. So Brian Mclaren, who's another postmodernist preacher, Brian Mclaren said, the church just needs to take a 5-year hiatus on talking about homosexuality. We need to not talk about homosexuality for 5 years. And then we'll come back and revisit it. Because there's just too much, he said, built up in the church about it. I think if we just take a break from talking about it, then when we come back together, then maybe we can have a more reasonable discussion. Another preacher was discussing this, and he said, hey, that's great. How about this? I've got somebody who comes into my office tomorrow, and they say, hey, I'm struggling with homosexual desire. I look at them and say, well, I'd love to help you, but the church is not talking about homosexuality for the next 5 years. So I'll get back to you in 5 years. It's like, what do they expect is going to happen here? And this other minister was like, this is just absolutely stupid. But this is the kind of thing that a lot of POMO people will do. They'll say sexuality is just, there are all these different stories. We got to be careful with not hurting people's feelings, letting them to tell their story their way. Most of the postmodern churches have gone full on liberal Christianity, embracing pretty much everything that, without transgenderism is rife in that sector. You've got homosexuality that's filling up a lot of these churches as well, because they're not telling anybody that they're engaged in sin. Sin's just not discussed.
So as we get further toward the end times, which we seem to be sliding downhill really quickly.
Yep.
Don't you think there's going to be more and more of a discrepancy between churches? I mean, I think there's not going to be a lot of middle.
Yeah.
There's going to be churches that are holding fast and churches that are very postmodern.
Yeah.
I think it's going to get clearer and clearer who's where.
Yeah.
Like when we grew up, everybody was just like church.
Mm-hmm.
We all believed kind of the same things. We all were kind of there, and a little bit of different denominational stuff.
Yep.
But it's going to be black and white.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Something like the Equality Act might help usher that in really quick. If yeah, if you're not familiar with that, the objective is to basically have any version of equality that the government decides is equality trump religious freedom. So a congregation like ours could not tell somebody that they could or could not be part of the church based on a sinful lifestyle that would be considered protected, which means that we would lose tax exempt status and probably be shut down or be targeted with lawsuits. And so the church would have to go underground. And that might happen in the next year or so. So just be aware. If it happens, I'm sure we'll talk about it.
Sexuality.
Yeah.
All
Oh, yeah.
all beliefs are the same.
Right. Correct.
Even I think from what I'm hearing, you're going to be required to hire either an atheist or Hindu or Buddhist or Muslim or whatever who wants a job as your children's minister.
Yeah.
They have to have equal footing. If you didn't hire them, you have to explain why.
Right.
It better not be because they believe something different.
Right.
We know a preacher in Tennessee who their church will not do a legal wedding. State with they say go get married at the justice of the peace, and then come here, and we'll do a Christian religious ceremony. But they won't sign the certificates. That way, if somebody comes and says, "Hey, we're gay, we want you to marry us," and they said, "Well, we don't do weddings."
Right. Yeah. The church policy here is that we do not do weddings. I, as a minister, can choose to do a wedding for a friend of mine as a favor, but the church does not have an official. It will not conduct weddings as a church. So somebody cannot just come to the church and say, "I desire to be married by someone in this church." Somebody could approach me and I could say, "No, I'm not going to do that," or "Yeah, I'll do that." But that's the official position here. Northern Hills, the church I came from, took that as a position in order to stave off the possibility of lawsuits, because it's going to land sometime in the next decade. You're going to have mass lawsuits start where people will just find churches that they can plug into, tell the leaders they want to get married, get a date on the calendar, and then inform people that, it's a wedding that nobody in the church is going to approve of, and then sue the church into oblivion.
Well, there's no place in the Bible where it says you have to be married in the church.
Correct. Yeah, absolutely.
Take the old fashioned Isaac and Rebecca.
Yeah.
Get off the camel, you're down.
That's right. All right. Just know these, just a few of the names. Rob Bell and Brian Mclaren are two of the leaders in the postmodern church movement. There are a number of other ones now. And it's not so much that you're just listening for those people, but listen for those people being cited positively, as in Rob Bell says, as soon as that starts happening, you need to probably back off of whoever you're listening to. A lot of social justice takes kind of front stage or center stage rather in postmodern churches, POMO churches. Social justice warriors. All right. So when people set the gospel of Jesus Christ aside, what is the purpose of existence? What's the point of humankind? This is a real question, you guys, right now. What is the purpose of humankind? What is the meaning of the human experience for you, a Christian? What do you think it is? What? Make disciples, right? So we are disciples. We are followers of the Christ who make followers of the Christ, right? And as a follower of the Christ, I'm rescuing people. When I make a disciple, I'm rescuing people from the wrath of Almighty God. When they come to follow him and begin pursuing him in this life, I'm not just giving them a purposeful, meaningful life right now, but there's a scenario that God has painted where human beings have set themselves against him. They are his enemies. And through the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, people can be introduced into the family of God. They're no longer an enemy. The sins are done away with. They can be saved. That's the purpose of Christianity. So a postmodern church will say the purpose of Christianity is to promote human flourishing. The purpose of humanity is to help equalize things and make people feel included. It's inclusiveness. That's what the church is all about. Oh, yeah. Now they've taken, there's some good ideas in there, right? I want human beings to flourish, but ultimately flourishing in this life is like rearranging decks chairs on the deck of the Titanic. We're dying. Every one of us is dying. So we're not trying to promote ourselves permanently here on this earth. The idea is ultimately that we get ready, not just in this life, but for the next life. Postmodern churches don't do that. They begin focusing on the specific attributes. You should care more about the poor. You should do more for the orphans and the widows. Now listen to the way I just said that. You should care more about the poor. You should do more about the orphans and the widows, because this is the way the postmodern church does this. They're not a Matthew 25 ministries. They criticize other people. This is why it flourishes on Facebook. They're all about telling you what you're doing wrong. They'll call you a racist, and you say, "Well, I've got a number of black members of my family. I'm adopting a black young man right now." Well, you're still a racist, and you're still part of the problem. Have you adopted anyone? And they would probably go, no, but I'm telling people what needs to happen with the church. It's a whole bunch of middle managers that are trying to tell the church what we need to do in order to be right by God. All right. Criticisms of postmodernism. Let's deconstruct postmodernism. Let me show you why this doesn't work. First of all, the relativism of language. Here's what postmodernists will say, things like this. Language really can mean different things to different people. And so you can, as soon as words are out of your mouth, you don't know that you've communicated what you think you communicated. Because those words travel when they were received by another ear and another mind. And so those words we can't say will actually communicate any real meaning. Whatever was in your head is not necessarily in their head.
So how do I know what you're talking about?
That is the best response, right? Or a good response is, so raisins on celery is awful. That's not what I said. What I said was, as soon as the words leave your mouth, and what you're doing is just showing them, you don't believe that. If you believe that, you wouldn't even said that to me.
You don't always have to use words though.
Right?
Action.
That's true. And you can demonstrate truths through actions. But the problem is, as soon as somebody starts telling you that words can't convey objective meaning, the easy response is, well, what does that mean?
Without using words.
Well, they use the words. They're trying to express an idea that words have no objective meaning. But if they've communicated it successfully to me, yeah, they've proved their claim wrong in just the fact that I actually understood what they said. All right. Rife with contradiction. Relativism of epistemology. Epistemology is the logic of knowing. Right? So they'll say, everybody knows things in different ways and has different understandings. We can't possibly know the same thing. All right, so no one set of knowledge that one person has can never be necessarily a set of knowledge that another person has. And again, you respond, well, I understood what you just said, and I think I know what you mean.
Can you argue from like an abstract point of view at that point with like transcendent knowledge?
Yeah, and actually the Christian is on much better footing than most anybody else is here. A naturalist has a difficult time arguing with a postmodernist. A nihilist would probably not argue with a postmodernist. An existentialist would probably fall in line and just become a postmodernist, and that's what I think has happened in large part during this past century. But a Christian says, no, ideas have objective meaning, and there is a reality beyond. Words describe realities, and that's the way we were engineered. God put us together with language and the concept of language. And so language is a medium we use. Just like the air we breathe, it is a function of this existence. And the postmodernists would say, well, that's your story. All right. Here's the problem with postmodernism. Start criticizing it. They only thrive by criticism. So long as they're criticizing, they're okay. But start deconstructing postmodernism. Why would you think that way? Explain to me why you believe that everything is just a story. Could you be wrong? Explain to me in what way you might be wrong. Yeah, how did you learn this ideology? It came from another narrative, right? You have a story. Postmodernism is itself a story. Relativism of ethics. In postmodernism, by the way, kind of everything goes. That's generally the way it's framed up, unless they want to criticize a particular person or group. Relativism of ethics, they typically just don't believe. When it comes right down to it, they're all relativistic in terms of ethics when it comes to sexuality until they get their feet stepped on. They're relativistic when it comes to how we make money or how we pursue things until they get their feet stepped on. All right, here's a criticism that is a very powerful criticism. Postmodernists like to believe everything's a power play. It's all a power play. You, white privileged people, are controlling things. Capitalism is controlling things. That's an idea that's controlling things. Christianity is a dominating, controlling power in the West. And the simple question you turn back on them is, if postmodernism is a narrative, isn't it a meta-narrative? Isn't it being used to control? And couldn't I even point to specific ways you have engineered language to try to propagate your control pattern? I think I can. Things like the use of the term phobic. Right? That would be a specific power play. Somebody was actually trying to control the whole narrative using those ideas. So postmodernism is itself a power play. The thing that they criticize everybody else for, they're also guilty of. And by the way, if you point this out to a postmodernist, they'll probably go, yeah, probably. Postmodernism is vague and jargon laden. Postmodernism thrives on confusion and confusing terms. The Sokol affair. Has anyone ever heard of the Sokol affair? All right, I'll just summarize this briefly. There was a guy who was an academic. He wrote a paper titled Transgressing the Boundaries Toward a Transformative Hermeneutics of Quantum Gravity, which was published in a postmodern magazine. Went into the postmodern magazine, and on the day that that postmodern magazine was released, he did an interview with another magazine where he lambasted the article he wrote. He wrote it as a hoax to demonstrate that postmodernists have no idea what they're talking about. He filled it with all this jargon and just ridiculous ideas. Here's what he says. He says, it was a pastiche of left-wing cant, fawning references, grandiose quotations, and outright nonsense, which was structured around the silliest quotations I could find about mathematics and physics made by postmodern academics. He completely made up, and they published it as a scientific article in one of these magazines, and he knew it was going to pass through it just because of the language he was using. And so then he came out in another magazine and just bashed this postmodernism. But the postmodernists were furious at this because they were being like publicly mocked. And it was hilarious though. The Sokol affair. Here's the deal. If you use the right linguistics, you can almost move anything past these people. I had a friend when we were at Miami University who got $10,000 per semester approved from the university for a Kung Fu club that we put together called the Flying Fists of Friendliness. And do you know how he did it? He used the word equality and diversity over and over again in his appeal. He then got the university to pay for like $7,000 worth of computer equipment so that he could spend the summer hiking the Appalachian Trail and recording himself hiking the Appalachian Trail, and a stipend for him to do that. And he did the same thing. He just used the catchwords that the academics love to hear and want to hear, and that the administration wants to hear. It's clever. We took the money. We got a few things with the money for the Kung Fu Club, but we usually just ended up watching like Mystery Science Theater as a group. It was quite fun. We were talking about actually bringing out the cast of Mystery Science Theater because we had enough to have them do a single appearance, but we never did. It would have been amazing. Anyway, here's the problem. Postmodernism is wrong if it's right. Postmodernism is wrong if it's right. If all things are narratives and cannot be known, and we got to treat all meta-narrative with incredulity, it can't be true. And postmodernism is true, then postmodernism is it's a meta-narrative and therefore not true. If postmodernism is true, it is not true. If it describes reality as it is, then it undermines itself. It cuts off the branch it's sitting on. It cannot be true. All right, that's postmodernism in a nutshell. Questions, comments about postmodernism and the way it's corrupting our culture?
I found it interesting that one of their biggest gripes is about words. The narrative, using words that when God has made words. In the beginning was the word, with God. Yes. Jesus is the word. Yeah. And I think one of the most amusing and wonderful passages I've found in the last few years. Yeah. Reflecting on Paul's trip to the third heaven. Yeah. When he gets back, he didn't write a book and say 30 minutes in heaven or any of this other stuff. When he gets back, I would be so eager to hear what heaven's like. Yeah. What did he say? Couldn't describe it. I heard words that men are not allowed to speak. Yeah. Okay. You couldn't tell me about the colors, the sounds, the music. You couldn't tell me about the clouds. You couldn't tell me about what Jesus was. He said the only thing he liked, I heard words that men are not allowed. The words are so wonderful, so pure, so holy that my mouth and your mouth is not allowed to speak them. The only thing you could talk about was the words. Yeah. And words are holy. Right. Jesus is the word. He's holy. Yeah. So for them to take the idea of words and narrative as something evil that we should shun. Yeah. And Christianity is just solid and based on what words are. Right. And I thought that Paul could have made a lot of money by selling his book. And to come back and that be the only thing. And that's by the way, Jesus said, I got a lot of stuff I could tell you, but you couldn't handle it.
Yeah.
I think Paul did see stuff he might have been able to communicate.
Yeah.
We can't even handle saying the words.
Right. Right.
What's that going to be like?
Right.
Can't do the words.
Yeah.
It's just words. It's not just words.
So nowadays they're changing words to change the narrative.
Yep.
Going back as far as the abortion issue, they changed
Sure.
it to pro-choice
Yeah.
instead of murder.
Right.
And, so.
Pro murder just doesn't sound as good.
And you change the whole narrative then.
Sure.
Oh, you're pro-murder? No, I'm pro-choice.
Right.
Oh, okay.
I'm all about choosing. Choosing things is good. I like to choose. That's not what we're talking about. Yeah. The usage of language and the control of language, we're going to see this cropping up in years to come as well. Christians are already being defined as bigots in a number of ways. I mean, if you do not adhere to a lot of modern policies and ideas, you are bigoted, you are narrow-minded. And that'll be used as a bludgeon against us in years to come. But post-modernity allows this to be possible. Notice critical thinking is not even coming into play here. Like if I challenge a person on postmodern ideas and I say, that doesn't make any sense, and I begin deconstructing what they're saying, here's why that doesn't work. Most of them will just say something like, I'm offended, or that really upsets me that you would think that, or that's just your story. All it takes is a name calling or something else, and most of the culture just backs away and goes, we're not even going to mess with this. We're not going to deal with it. We're getting more and more that way. We used to be in a situation where we could debate most anything, and rigorous ideas could come in conflict. But ideas are not allowed to come into conflict anymore.
And there's more narrative. That
Yeah.
if I'm offended, then you're wrong and I'm right.
Yeah.
And you can't offend me, and I'm a cynic.
Yeah.
There's another word.
The number one response to Christian ideas right now, if I were to go out into downtown Cincinnati or go over to Walmart, maybe not Walmart, but just go into a crowd of people and I were to start talking to people about Jesus and I were to express the ideas of Christ, probably the most prevalent argument that would be leveled against me would be this: I can't even.
I can't what?
I can't even. Have you heard people do that? I can't even. Like, I can't even deal with this. Like, you're just, what you're,
Like a 2-year-old.
it is. And that's exactly what's happening. We've kind of promoted this infantile mindset in a lot of the adults today, to where people, if they get offended, and if they act like you're just so ridiculous, they can turn around and feel like they have a victory in an argument because they're not dealing with ideas anymore. They're escaping from ideas. Your ideas are uncomfortable for me. You have no right to make me uncomfortable.
Trigger warning.
Yeah.
You're going to be warned that there's going to be an idea that might make you uncomfortable, so not.
Right.
Don't,
Careful. Ideas can hurt. They can be very uncomfortable. Yeah, it's kind of messed up. Now, you're going to see postmodernism, if you just think about it in those terms: meta-narrative, criticism of everything, criticism of anything that claims to have absolute truth. Start paying attention to everything that's around you right now. You're going to see it all over our culture. This is the natural, postmodernism, I think, is the natural outworking of that progression from naturalism, or from deism to naturalism, to nihilism, to existentialism. I think that rolled right into postmodernism. And I think it, to some degree or another, it might have danced around even a little bit of Eastern pantheistic monism and some of the New Age ideas. But we've arrived at this state where people are just like, everybody's got ideas. We're not going to tell anybody that they're wrong. Everybody gets to be right, but we will deconstruct anything and everything that emerges that tries to tell us what absolute truth is. If you're okay with everybody having their own truth, we'll leave you alone. But if you believe there is an absolute binding truth on all human beings, we'll destroy you.
So what do we do with it?
Speak boldly and let them.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
I can't even think.
You can show them the inconsistencies. You can draw those things out. I think ultimately we're depending on